Yassas. Welcome to Greek Like Me, the podcast about all things Greek for Greeks, Hellenophiles, and anyone interested in learning about other cultures. I'm your host, Pamela Diodes Wood. Email us at stealthgreek@gmail.com to share comments, questions, and stories about Greeks, Greekness, or your own ethnic background. Chronia Pola! Happy Greek Independence Day, or Greek National Day as they call it in the mother country, celebrated March 25th in Greece and throughout the world by the Greek diaspora. Here in the northeastern U.S., the Greek Independence Day Parade in New York City will take place on Sunday, April 14th at 1 p.m. on 5th Avenue from 64th to 79th Street. Our home church, St. Nicholas, Constantine, and Helen of Roseland, New Jersey, will be representing. It's a great opportunity to see the Avzones, the Special Presidential Guard. They fly in from Athens to celebrate with us. And they also stop in Philadelphia, a great city with a Greek name. They have an entire weekend of celebrations planned. Check that out at Hellenic Federation website, hellenicfed.org. Their parade is Sunday, April 7th, starting at 2 p.m. east on Ben Franklin Parkway from 22nd Street to City Hall. You might see Douglas John. He makes it his business to go to both cities for as many events as he's able to attend. Greek Independence Day marks the anniversary of the official start of the Greek Revolution in 1821 to overthrow more than 400 years of Ottoman occupation. There had been local uprisings throughout mainland Greece and many of the islands for years. Uprising mostly resulting in the slaughter of rebels, as well as any civilians living in the towns the rebels came from. The pashas, the Ottoman officials running the regional governments for the Sultan, were almost uniformly brutal in their suppression of resistance. Those few more sympathetic to the plight of the Greeks didn't try to change the system. They benefited from it. Their lands, their riches allowed them to live in great comfort. Their households included harems, and among their number were often Greek women, snatched from their homes if they caught the eye of the pasha, or purchased from slave blocks. So to address occasional Turkish claims that Greeks were treated well by the overlords, we ask, were there any good pashas? Were there any good slaveholders or traders in Egypt, where some of the biggest slave markets in the region were located? Were there good slaveholders in the American South, the Caribbean, anywhere? Of course, the answer is no. Subjugating people is bad, always. Therefore, people doing the subjugating are bad. Not their descendants, unless they deny it ever happened. Then they're bad too. There are many documented episodes of uprisings, massacres, persecution, and cruelty, recorded by European historians, travelers, and tourists, witnesses basically, and by the Ottoman authorities, who kept amazingly detailed records, and by the Greeks. We'll explore this topic on Greek Like Me again and again, through the experiences of different regions, different uprisings, because these events together shaped what would become the Greek state. The repercussions have been felt in the 200-plus years since the revolution started, through the Civil Wars, Balkan Wars, World War I, the Greco-Turkish War, the catastrophe of the 1920s, World War II, the Cyprus invasion, and the continued strained relationship between Greece and Turkey. But today we're going to explore the years leading up to the revolution through the experiences of one woman, the most famous woman to take part in the Greek fight for freedom, in a patriarchal society that more often than not underplayed the impact she had on the events of the revolution. A forceful, tough-talking warrior and leader who dedicated her fortune, her life, and the lives of her children to freeing Greece once and for all from the Ottoman Empire. We're talking about Kapitanisa Laskarina Bouboulina, widow, mother, shipowner, naval commander, military strategist, warrior, patriot, badass of badasses. There will be a part 2, where we'll jump into the incredible exploits of the Greek heroine during the war, her battles, powerful connections, the political rivals who tried to blunt her influence, her tragic, untimely death. Was it really a personal vendetta or an assassination? And we'll talk about her legacy. Many of the unsung heroes of the revolution were women. Those few who did make their way into public consciousness were never accorded the respect or the accolades the men were. In an extremely patriarchal society, women had their place, and it was rarely in the pages of history. Even Bouboulina has been given short shrift in the history books. But scholars continue to scour the archives, Ottoman and Greek, documents, memoirs, travelogues, histories, and letters from all over the world, and they've examined these documents in relation to the climate and realities of her life. So we know more now about the so-called Greek Joan d'Arc than we ever have before. Her story has always been amazing, but placed in the context of the brutal politics and entrenched patriarchal system as they existed during the Greek Revolution, her actions and accomplishments are truly astonishing. First, let's set the stage. Any part of the Greek Revolution and everything leading up to it produced tremendous amounts of documentation and a great deal of scholarly work. It's complicated and it's layered. So we're going to simplify. Give a bare bones background. The Ottoman Empire was enormous and lasted for 600 years. At the height of its power, it stretched from North Africa as far west as Algeria, with big swaths of the Arabian Peninsula, through much of the Middle East, including Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Palestine, all of Greece, all of the Balkans, most of southeastern Europe, including Hungary and parts of Ukraine. These lands were totally dominated and controlled by their Turkish overlords. Lands that the Russian Empire to the northwest coveted. Starting in the 16th century, the Russian Empire began pushing to expand south into Ottoman territory, with wars and skirmishes that popped up sporadically over 150 years. Decades before the Greek Revolt, 18th century Russian Empress Catherine the Great implemented what was called the Greek Plan. It involved freeing Greece and ultimately other areas included in the original Byzantine Empire. She wanted to resurrect the seat of the Orthodox Church in Constantinople and place her son at the head of the new Byzantine Empire. For over 100 years, Greek lands were infiltrated by Russian spies who tried to gather Greeks to the cause. Revolutionary talk had long bounced around Hydra and Spetsis, two Greek islands near the eastern coast of mainland Greece. Both were famous seafaring, shipbuilding centers of commerce. Barke Torunolu is an assistant professor of history at Bilkent University in Ankara, with a focus on Ottoman Empire. He says during Ottoman occupation, Greeks owned the largest merchant navy in the eastern Mediterranean, and Spetsis and Hydra stood out. Quote, records of that time show their shipbuilding was extremely skilled. So skilled that the wealthy Ottoman Empire contracted with both islands to build ships for the imperial navy in lieu of collecting taxes from them. The Ottomans weren't known for their ability to build ships or manage them, so the Ottoman navy paid experienced Greek sailors from the same islands to crew their ships as they patrolled the Mediterranean. We'll find out later how that went. This was the world Lascarina Pinozzi was born into in May of 1771. Her father, Stavrianos, or Stavros Pinotzis, was a ship captain from Hydra. He'd sailed under the Russian flag during the 1770 Orlov Revolt, the Orlovika, one of those Russian-Turkish skirmishes we mentioned. The campaign, commanded by Admiral Alexei Orlov of the Imperial Russian Navy, centered on the Peloponnesos region of southern Greece. This revolt was what researcher and university professor April Kalogeropoulos Householder called a major precursor to the Greek War of Independence. It failed. Russian and Turkish forces would continue to clash repeatedly in the following years. But in 1770, Captain Stavros Pinotzis and many other Greeks who had participated in the ill-fated Orlov uprising were arrested and thrown into the Ottoman prison system in Constantinople. I didn't find out which prison he landed in, but as a rule, they were dark, damp prison towers. Stavros had a young wife, and when he became ill during his incarceration, the very pregnant, very determined Paraskevi Kokino Pinozzi sailed from their home in Hydra to Constantinople and made her way to the prison. She was there visiting her ailing husband when she went into labor. Lascarina was born there, inside the prison. Before long, Stavros would die there. Before leaving Constantinople, Patriarchy asked a Maniot rebel from the southern Peloponnesos, Panayotis Troupakis Murtsinos, to be the baby's godfather. There were always rebels sneaking in and out of the capital. Maybe he'd fought with Stavros in the uprising. They were obviously both fighting for the freedom of their homeland. Murtsinos named the baby Lascarina after his mother, which also happened to be the name of a 13th century Byzantine princess. After the baptism, Patriarchy returned to her home in Hydra with baby Lascarina. But while she was gone, visiting her dying husband, the house and property had been claimed by Stavros' two sisters. Widows in Hydra at that time had no claim on their husband's estate. So Patriarchy, Skevo, and baby had no home and no support. Finally, Skevo left Hydra, and who can blame her, living in the shadow of her former home, displaced by the grasping sisters. She moved to the nearby island of Spetses, where she rented a small house and supported her baby by taking in embroidery. When Lascarina was 4 years old, Skevo married a Spetses ship captain, Vasileos Lazaru Orlov, who'd taken on the last bit of his name in honor of the Russian admiral of the failed uprising. I think the Ottoman authorities might not look on that name very kindly, but Lascarina's stepfather wore it proudly. He and Skevo went on to have 8 more children. Lascarina played along the waterfront growing up and studied the ways of the sailors working on the docks or on her stepfather's ship. Her 6th-generation descendant, Pavlov Demirtis Boubulis, director of the Bouboulina Museum on Spetses, says Bouboulina had a passionate love of the sea and traveled with her stepfather on his ships. Lazaru Orlov encouraged her to learn to sail, and the sailors, fishermen, and boatmakers at the waterfront were her teachers about everything maritime. She was a strong swimmer, rode horseback, fished, sailed. She grew up where the stories of the sea and admiration for Greek rebels and Klefts was strong. She knew the songs of the Klefts, the famous mountain rebels who ceaselessly harassed Ottoman authorities. And she grew up hearing the stories of the coming revolt against the oppressors. Her upbringing and education on the docks didn't mean Lascarina was the illiterate, ignorant woman European travelers in Greece reported her to be. Both during the revolutionary years and for years later, they pretty much dissed Greeks in general. She was educated by priests. Her stepfather had a full library with the writings of the greatest minds of the Enlightenment. He was a great admirer of Catherine the Great and believed in the advancement of women. Very, very rare at the time anywhere in the world. Lascarina spoke, read, and wrote letters in Greek, French, and Italian, and was reported to throw around Albanian cuss words with great skill. By the time Lascarina married for the first time at the age of 17, she was already extremely knowledgeable about all matters regarding the sea and the business of seafaring merchants. Her husband was a well-to-do ship captain named Dimitrios Yanouzis. They had 3 children and prospered together for 9 years before he was killed during a battle with Algerian pirates near the south of Spain. An 1890 article about her life in an American women's magazine claims Yanouzis was lost at sea with his crew and ship after it was struck by lightning. Articles appearing in American and European magazines and newspapers were often erroneous, sometimes hilarious. His death was well documented. Where the heck did the lightning come from? This is why scholars have had a huge task sifting through history to find the true Bouboulina. Lascarina was 26 years old when Yanouzis was killed by pirates. She had enough money from her estate to live comfortably with their children. 4 years later, she married again to Dimitrios Boubulis, a very wealthy ship captain, said to be her childhood love. Boubulis had 3 young children from his first marriage. He and Lascarina had another 4, bringing the number of children she was raising to 10. Tragically, 10 years after her second marriage, Lascarina was widowed again. when Bouboulis was killed in another fracas with Algerian pirates, possibly in the crossfire between the pirates and a French frigate. The same 1890 article in the Women's Magazine reported Bouboulis lost his life to Algerian corsairs who were egged on by the Ottomans to harass Greek ships. Spets's captains seemingly benefited the Ottomans, as we've said, but maybe Bouboulis was a troublemaker. The magazine claims that after heroically driving off 2 pirate ships, he was struck on the forehead by a musket ball while watching said pirate ships retreat. I don't know. Maybe it happened that way. The only thing sources agree on is that he died battling Algerian pirates. It was 1811. Lascarina was 40 years old. There were constant battles with Algerian pirates who roamed through the Mediterranean, attacking merchant ships like those owned by the 2 Demetriuses. In Greek Women Warriors from the Revolution to the Civil War, Sakis Geka says both of Bouboulina's husbands dying that way wasn't so strange, and, quote, reveals the extent of fighting in the Mediterranean between traders and pirates and merchants. She goes on to say that captains from the Greek islands were renowned for switching between the two. Interesting, we can wonder if the captains Lascarina married were attacking or defending themselves when they died. The Algerian pirate situation was so extreme that later on even the U.S. Navy would join the Brits and French fighting those same pirates to protect trade profiting the respective countries. Between her 2 deceased husbands, Lascarina had inherited merchant ships, shares in other merchant ships, houses, plots of land, and from Bouboulis, 300,000 in Spanish notes, a form of cash widely used in the Mediterranean. Unlike Hydra, Spetses recognized a widow's claim on her husband's estate. With savvy investments, including partnerships in even more merchant vessels, Lascarina increased her fortune. Now known as Bouboulina, a nickname identifying her as the wife of Bouboulis, rather than the proper Kiria Boubouli, she stood out as a wealthy woman, an educated woman, an independent woman, at a time when that triple threat was practically unknown in the heavily patriarchal Greek culture. Yeah, I keep saying that word, and I'll probably say it again before we're through. Back then, women were assigned a value based on their ability to fit prescribed gender roles. They were a commodity that with a proper dowry would benefit their fathers with valuable political and financial ties. And in most cases, they had no choice in the identity of the groom. At the death of their fathers or even their husbands, male relatives would decide whether or not women received an inheritance, or how much. All legal matters were decided by the closest male relatives, including divorce. If it didn't benefit the wife's family, there wasn't one. Patriarchy. Bouboulina bucked the system. Her marriage to her first husband had most likely been arranged. The second was believed to be a love match. But Bouboulina's brothers and sons didn't get to call the shots. She did. She handled the money she inherited, invested it herself. She sailed her ships, or decided who did. She met with men later known to be revolutionaries, sometimes in her own home. Naughty. She also had a reputation for being able to drink the most masculine of men under the table, according to encyclopedia.com and quite a few other sources. From existing documents historians have examined, Bouboulina seems to have been fortunate in both her stepfather and 2 husbands, who were not intimidated by her curiosity or her strong personality. She had confidence in her business acumen, her seafaring skills, and in how to outfit ships. Her great wealth made her powerful. She wasn't intimidated by men and rebelled against society's expectations for a widow and a mother, a woman. Kalogeropoulos Householder says, in the early 19th century, most women were not educated, did not have a voice in public life. Bouboulina did. She, in fact, had an unprecedented level of education and extensive foreign networks. All those letters she was writing in French and Italian, she was spreading support for the cause. There are many references in memoirs and letters that Bouboulina was involved in talks and plans that eventually led to the Greek Revolution. She wasn't trapped in the kitchen making cafés while men were saving the world. She was right in there, fighting every bit as hard as her fellow revolutionaries. In 1814, a secret Greek revolutionary society, Philiki Etaria, meaning friendly company, was founded by Greek merchants in Odessa, a port city in southern Ukraine. In the 19th century, it was the fourth largest city in the Russian Empire, annexed from the Ottomans in 1792, a few years after the Russians had stormed the area. It had been part of the Ottoman Empire for over 300 years, so chock full of former Ottoman Greeks. Russian aggression and Greek unrest seemed to go hand in hand. The Russians were fellow Orthodox Christians, and they were powerful. This encouraged the Greek rebels to believe they had a chance. Russia wanted more Ottoman territory. The Greeks wanted freedom. So the Russians backed the Philiki Etaria. Its purpose was to throw off the Ottoman occupation and establish an independent Greek state. The Russians viewed it as a supporting role for the Greek plan. There were already Greek officers in the Russian military and Greek advisors to the Russian Empire, and they all participated in the friendly company. The most famous and influential rebels and revolutionaries of Greece were initiated into the secret society. And many sources claim Bouboulina was the one woman allowed in. We'll get into this shortly. In 1816, Bouboulina continued to prosper, and the Ottoman government took notice. Spetses like Hydra was mostly left to itself for providing those well-designed warships to the Ottoman fleet. But none of the Greeks should become too wealthy, right? And she was a woman. Captain Bouboulis had participated in one of the other Russo-Turkish wars, the one from 1806 to 1812. So he was a troublemaker. The Ottoman authorities were ready to see Bouboulina's property armed with a decree from the Sultan himself, because it was ill-gotten gains by a rebel against the empire. Bouboulina was at risk for losing everything. Her ships had flown under the Russian flag for some time, but that was allowed by the Ottomans under the 1774 treaty with Russia, the break in the action between the wars. Greek merchants used that flag because it gave them freedom to travel throughout the Mediterranean under protection of the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire had clout, enough to make pirates and brigands think twice. Bouboulis had received many honors from Russia, including honorary citizenship. After learning of the order to seize her property, Bouboulina sailed to Constantinople, where she met with the Russian ambassador. She handed Ambassador Stroganov papers that were given to her late husband by a Russian admiral, declaring Bouboulis' great service to the empire during the war. She was put under Russian protection, and Stroganov agreed to advocate for her, which seems ironic since the Ottomans were penalizing Bouboulina's dead husband for supporting the Russian war against them. But Stroganov secured a place for her to stay in Crimea. Rumors were it was a residence belonging to the Tsar himself. But before she left Constantinople for her 3-month sojourn into Russian territory, Bouboulina stopped off to visit Sultana Nakshidil Walide, mother of reigning Sultan Mahmud II, he who had signed the orders to confiscate Bouboulina's property. Walide Sultana may have been the most powerful woman in the world, and she had the ear of the Sultan. Legend has it the Sultana was so impressed with the strength and character of Bouboulina, she interceded on her behalf and persuaded her son to issue a firman, or royal decree, relinquishing the empire's claim to Bouboulina's property. The claim against the Bouboulis estate was ultimately rescinded, and if it wasn't through the Sultana's intervention, then whose? Bouboulina returned home to Spetses and began accumulating a stockpile of weapons and ammunition, mostly purchased on trading trips to Malta. She smuggled them back to the island on the ships that the Sultan had graciously left in her possession, and then hid them in the homes she'd retained. Over the next few years, with the money he'd allowed her to keep, Bouboulina continued to secretly stockpile weapons. And she met with the young revolutionary priest Papaflessas, who is absolutely going to be featured in a future episode. They met in 1818 to talk revolution and strategy. In 1819, Bouboulina traveled briefly to Constantinople, where some sources claim she was officially initiated into the Filiki Etaria and made privy to the details of the coming uprising. Some historians completely support that she was a member. Others say it's impossible because women were not allowed to join. Women were not welcome. It was gris. Some say there were no female members, others that there were a few female members. And there are those who say Bouboulina was the one and only female member. Membership was open to the merchants of the islands and rebel leaders throughout the mainland. Her husband's brothers and her godfather were members, so she had close ties. As a nearly 50-year-old, twice-widowed woman who was a wealthy ship owner, she might have been the exception. Her name does not show up on the historical members list, but it has been brought up repeatedly that most members signed using false names, and many documents relating to the secret society were destroyed so they wouldn't fall into the wrong hands. She certainly went on to participate in early important battles and was well known to the strategists of the war. As we said, she'd been meeting with revolutionaries. Kalogeropoulos' householder says she interacted with and commanded many who were members. She was granted that power. There's the theory women's names weren't recorded on the rolls to protect them. Protecting women was a man's job, and if this lady was going to consort and plan and fight like a man, at least the society was still doing its job. Honestly, we may never know. Bouboulina used a chunk of her considerable wealth to build 4 merchant ships at Spetses, bringing her personal fleet up to 8 in number. The largest of these new ships was the Agamemnon, which was 10 feet longer than most merchant ships. She needed permission from the Ottoman administration to proceed with the shipbuilding, a license to build based on specifications she'd been required to submit. The Bouboulina Museum in Spetses has the plans for the Agamemnon. You can see them and a lot of other very cool items belonging to a woman warrior on YouTube video interview conducted by UCLA that will link to the podcast notes. When questioned about the size of the Agamemnon, Bouboulina told the authorities she was building it to protect her property from pirates and other criminals. That made sense. And she was having a couple of cannons added for the same reason. That and a generous bribe to the officer sent to inspect the construction of the ship got her the license she needed. The Agamemnon was completed in 1820 at great expense. It was 33 meters or 108 feet long and was fitted with 18 cannons. She once said she used lies and bribery to build the Agamemnon. At the same time the Agamemnon was being built, she'd been recruiting sailors and soldiers. She put together a large band of fighters she called My Brave Lads. Her sons and a few of her brothers were part of that group. The Agamemnon alone was manned by more than 80 sailors. She outfitted, armed, and paid the salaries of her men and for the support of their families, preparing for the coming war. On March 13, 1821, 12 days before the official start of the revolution, Bouboulina was the first to raise the flag of the revolution from the masts of the Agamemnon, an eagle with wings lowered, and beside it a phoenix rising from the flames. Some sources say it was a version of an old flag of the Byzantine Empire. She ordered the firing of a cannon to salute the flag. Bouboulina's sailors and soldiers were ready to fight. She'd already begun sending arms, food, and other supplies to support the armies on the mainland. On April 4th, Spetses officially joined the revolution, followed by Hydra and Psara. Between the 3 islands, more than 300 ships prepared to take part in the uprising. Tornolu writes that when Spetses and Hydra joined the revolt, quote, with their quick ships, the Greek rebels turned the eastern Mediterranean into a highway of insurgents, exporting the revolt to other islands. As more islands and coastal communities took up the cry for freedom, things escalated quickly. Encyclopedia.com states almost every Greek captain and sailor in Greece volunteered to fight. Whoever wrote the entry for the Greek Revolution on Encyclopedia.com must be Greek because you can feel the passion, and I couldn't say it any better. After thousands of years of seafaring and handling risk, quote, Greek mariners had a tradition as warriors as well as sailors. For centuries, they'd honed their battle skills against Barbary pirates and brigands from their own communities. From the start of the revolution, it was clear that control of the sea would determine the outcome of the war. With virtually all the maritime community of the Greek archipelago rising up against the Ottomans, did the Ottomans stand a chance? The Ottoman Navy had the newly formed Greek Navy outnumbered and outgunned, but, quote, the Greek sailors were superbly experienced men of the sea, willing to die for their cause. They held the upper hand in the epic struggle for Hellenic freedom. Remember when we said the bulk of the soldiers in the Sultan's Navy were Greek? They abandoned their posts in droves to join the revolution. The Ottoman military began grabbing peasants and people hanging around the docks and dragging them on to man their suddenly empty ships. These reluctant crews were inexperienced and almost to a man against Turkish rule. Bouboulina took the helm of her flagship Agamemnon, the largest vessel involved in the fight for Greek freedom, and led her fleet of 8 ships to join others from Spetses in sailing west to begin an 18-month blockade of the city of Nafplion. She was not just a wealthy widow who plotted with the insurgents behind closed doors, or supplied ships and their crews with weapons and rations they needed to fight a long war. She was now recognized as a fierce Greek naval commander, leading hundreds of men into battle. During the long blockade that held off Turkish reinforcements and prevented supplies from reaching the enemy army, she would repeatedly leave the Agamemnon and the direction of the fleet in the hands of one of her sons or brothers, and go ashore to lead scores of soldiers into battle, riding her ebony horse, slashing with her sword, brandishing her gilded pistol, going once again where Greek women were forbidden. In part 2, we'll dive into the exploits of Bouboulina, her victories, her losses, her kick-ass negotiations. We'll touch on the civil war that started in the middle of the revolution and nearly derailed the Greek fight for freedom. And we'll cover the machinations of her political foes, intimidated by her influence and power, and how Bouboulina's life was suddenly cut short, not in glorious battle, but maliciously at the hand of a fellow Greek. Thanks for listening. Greek Like Me is a Stealth Greek production. This episode was researched, written, and narrated by me, your host, Pamela Diodes Wood. Our producer, photographer, and post-production editor is Douglas John. Thanks to Eduardo Gil for tracking down elusive sources, and to Stephanie Wood for getting the Kalogeropoulos householder book to me through University Interlibrary Loan. It is incredibly awesome. Visit our website at stealthgreek.com for resources, photos, links, and more. Please rate, like, and subscribe. It helps us get noticed so we can keep making content about Greeks and Greek culture. Find Greek Like Me on Facebook and on Instagram at Greek_like_me. Or visit our website, stealthgreek.com. See you next time. Yassas.
Salire